It's been so much fun, so much pleasure to hear all talk about your work for me. So thank you. I'm really glad to be here for the last panel, Memory Theater, who is not supposed to like fighting over the keynote. I guess I'm like reaching the limit of my capacity to multitask. All right, so Jennifer Pranolo is an interdisciplinary media scholar based in New York. Her writings on film, photography, and media have appeared in Screen, Film Quarterly, the edited volume of Screen Space Reconfigured, the Domus Magazine, and elsewhere. She's an assistant professor in film and screen studies at Pace University and a visiting critic at the Yale School of Art, and a visiting scholar with the Asian Pacific American Institute at NYU. She serves on the editorial board of Resolution, a journal of digital aesthetics. In her current research explores the history and aesthetics of simulation as it intersects with the emergence of the figure of the user in contemporary art, cinema, and computation culture. So I'm really thankful that you could make time to moderate our memory theater panel with Aliya, Al-adwani, McCusker, Hali, Natalie, Peterson, Pauline, Rossignol, and Fahmy, Shahin. So I'm really glad and looking forward to hearing you all talk about your work. And over to you. Thank you.
So thank you for having me to this finale of this thesis panel day. I first want to congratulate each of you on your amazing piece of work. We're completing it, and I'm very happy to have had a chance to see it and to be in conversation today. So this panel is called Memory Theater, and I wanted to begin the conversation by thinking about the theater part of that title. So my own background is primarily in film media, and I think of the theater. I think on the left hand of a stage or a screen. So this kind of architectural situation, performance, and projection, specifically designed to address audience, assembly, or spectators, or perceptual subjects. So all this idea of staging or putting on show or display of memory as the organizing topic of your pieces works, I was struck in my viewing of your pieces as they were installed in the gallery space how differently each of you choose to address the viewer, the listener, the witness in your material investigations of this kind of unstable temporality and spatiality of memory, of the process of remembering. So the formal multiplicity of your arrangements, kind of eclectic mise-en-scène, that are putting in place of your artistic objects and provocations around what memory is, how it functions or feels, leads me to a common analytic that I did, however, trace through many of your works, which is that of translation, or transition, or travel between times, places, selves, languages, names, archives, generations, histories, and most significantly, to my mind, different science systems, or kind of semiotic power structures to make meaning around complexities of identity and experience. So, towards this interpretive analytic of memory as a translation or transition between shifting science systems, I want to offer a passage from the poet and scholar Edgar Garcia from his 2020 book, Signs of the Americas, the Poetics of Photography, Hieroglyphs, and Kiku, in which he talks about the coexistence of multiple worlds and how it is through a practice of poetics of translation that we can perceive how words carry worlds and worlds are made of words. And so he says, and this is a quote from him, "The chaos of the world is incomplete and imperfect because it is the chaos of worlds. And each world has its own structures, forms, rhythms, and orders by which it organizes and gives meaning to chaos." So in other words, there's chaos in the world because there's more than one world, more than one language or signifying lens that exists to make sense of those worlds. And when we start to recognize that other science systems exist beyond the ones that we know, our spatial and temporal sensibilities can expand to perceive the variable and uneven realities of the global turbulence of intercultural contexts, ruptures, derangements, and reckonings that give rise, as Garcia says, to the echoes in which the world hears and understands itself beyond the singular abyss of a Western capitalist modernity. So, essentially, an encounter with this kind of aesthetics of changing science involves a passage or transient effervescence between people, places, and histories that not only centers the sign, but has the potential to shift us as viewers and sensory subjects from one frame of seeing and knowing into another, that may contradict, but yet coexist with the one with which you're situated. So that's all kind of to say that this is what I think that your works are doing, essentially. They're synthesizing this kind of chaos of worlds and words and systems in order to produce changing signs, or to embody memory via the diverse media that we use as a signifier of transition and translation that you kind of give shape, form, or narrative to within this kind of mutational iconography. So to start off the discussion, I'm interested to hear more about how each of you approach this problem of giving form to memory in your work, or basically how you stage it. So if memory does have this kind of liminal quality of existing somewhere between the past and the present, between cultures, between languages, between sites, what is the logic behind your material choices? So whether that be in terms of the media you use or the motifs for anchoring a central present for us as viewers and subjects in your exploration or evocation of what's past or what is absent. Just kicking off that.
Go. Rip off the Band-Aid. Yeah, well, first of all, thank you. I'm Hali. I think part of the reason why I feel like this is almost easier for me to go first is something Molly said in her panel, I think really kind of registered with kind of how I'm thinking about memory, and it was this idea of like building a space of re-experience, and this idea of like a shared re-experience and also a place for you to re-experience your memory. And obviously I'm working in painting, which is kind of very different from any of the mediums here and from VR, but I think in my work what I was trying to think about was kind of memory as like a verb or as a gerund is something that Sawan has actually talked with me about. And it's this idea of like what is the, rather than documenting a memory, which is kind of, I think, this very unstable, and I believe in your questions, it's this idea of like it's not necessarily something that can exist outside of the body. It changes each time you look back at it. And so rather than trying to document a memory, trying to document the process of remembering or mapping out the process of remembering. And for me, I think part of the reason why painting felt like such an appropriate way to do that is partially because I love painting. That's kind of how I think through things to begin with. But it allows things to be unreal in a certain way when you in sculpture or things like that. For me, whenever because I do sometimes work in those, there's a solidity to objects that get made. They exist as what they are, and even if what they are is referencing something else and it is not that thing, it is still itself. And I think in painting there's an ability for kind of multiple spaces and multiple perspectives and architectures and times and surfaces to interact in a way that really feels to me kind of it functions in the same way that like memory does. And the way what you're saying is memory is kind of looking at the past, but it is located in the present, and that kind of ability for multiple times and places to exist at the same time is something that feels very possible in painting. And kind of, this idea of kind of the portals that they can be, and to have also many exist together.
Yeah, when I think of memory, I think of how to meditate to memory, or how to mediate to memory, or what kind of structure can we use to approach like memory, and then even if I use one specific memory of myself like as a starting point, so but it's not about this, it's about sort of like a metaphorical way, like when we say life's a journey. So it's just a way to try to understand something so abstract and complex by means of poetry or like something. So I think of memory somehow as like the architecture of our sort of incorporeal like dimension, the architecture of the things that we can't really touch. And in this sense, it's like excavation. So to try to locate memory is like try to excavate, like we are in this sort of new land, but we know that underneath us a lot is being buried, but then where these things are located. And that's why I'm very interested in the topic of architecture, even though I don't really have architectural background, but I just think of architecture as an idea also to think of space and to think of sort of uncharted space. And I think like Evelina was talking about something about using the fence and just how like a gesture like this sort of explain or like gives a lot of context about what's inside, what's outside, sort of defining space. So if I think of memory as like architecture, sort of our brain or our mind, then I think of language as kind of the building blocks of this architecture, which is kind of what I try to do, sort of explore.
Yeah, thinking of materiality in memory for the work, I think I've been trying to put them in conversation with one another so we can serve each other and complement one another in the work. I'm thinking just of the material used for the projection and the screen. So the screen is made out of tea bags that were used as kind of a ritual to begin interviews with various family members. And so through the materiality, then the projected image on the material, at least the goal of it was to kind of create, to stage a space, to create a space where memory and the past can become present within the space and be activated through the material choice.
Yeah, I guess with memory, I came into the program working with like a traumatic memory and trying to find a way to talk about it with my audience, with my peers in a way that was sensitive. And I think with the type of system that we live in, the type of country that we're in, to talk about trauma, you just don't. Like it's silenced, you don't have a voice. And working with one singular project, it allowed me to develop all these different iterations around this topic to understand what my actual language was and what type of language I wanted to use to talk about trauma and memory and fragmentation around it. And I think with this program, it gave me the space to understand that a voice doesn't have to be something as literal as like a sound coming out of my vocal cords. My voice is with my drawing, that's my language. I talk with the paper, it talks back to me. And with all the different iterations I did of working with like theatrics, working with the camera, working with performative displays of pain and things like that, it made me see that there are different raw materials to help inform this language I have, but going into the final installation I made with ceramics and cable, it was something that ended up being very much tied to my drawing capabilities and that discipline. I don't know why or how, but it talked back to me. I had this language with the clay. I could draw in the space with the cables and redefine this whole space that I don't have a full picture of anymore. It's been fragmented over like 20 years. So I think being able to find a way to like talk about this also makes me connect more with my audience too, trying to find a way to create space for them as well so that it's not triggering for my audience, it's not triggering for myself either, because I want to go about this like through methods of compassion too. And earlier in the panels we talked about empathy, but for me compassion, it has a different level of care where you understand like everybody is a human being that is going to react differently to different things, and to try to take the actual literal image of my body out of the work and take the literal placement of my body in the space out of it. It just blew up the whole memory into a different way and allowed me to talk about it in a different way, I guess.
Yeah, how are you getting formed to memory? I think the short answer for my work is, or specifically for the thesis work, I'm not giving form to it. I think I'm specifically trying to do maybe not the opposite, but resist giving form to memory. The thesis work refers to work that I was doing in the studio throughout the academic year. The premise was to try to love the studio like a cherished friend, and the work manifested both as my own observations through drawing and video and a couple other mediums, and then as performances when folks were required to be in the studio for critiques and reviews and things like that. The piece in the gallery acknowledges that people had an experience, that the place or the moment of their encounter was the work, but and of course, if the moment of encounter was the work, then that is transformed into memory after the encounter has ended, and I got rid of all the work, destroyed it, all the material pieces, and all the performances have ended, which sort of doubles down on the memory as the ongoing medium of the work. But it was important to me to maintain the living memory as a sacred space of real encounter, rather than reducing it to a narrative about the experience of the work or to documentation. So the piece in the gallery, the text in the gallery, is a window that you look through and see the glow, the shapeless glow of living memory on the other side. And then there's the bench, which is not really about memory at all, but it's just an offering of hospitality.
I guess I'm kind of stuck on what you were actually saying at the beginning, which is this idea of the chaos of the complexity of multiples within memory, also just within life, I guess. But I guess is very much embedded within my work, and the existence of memory comes from those multiples in the forms and patterns that I'm referencing, that are kind of taken from the memory of a material culture that I'm no longer with, but in the same kind of way that memory allows for that kind of chaotic coexistence, that those forms are coexisting also with sort of like symbols and patterns from my present, specifically graffiti from bathrooms and walls. And yeah, I guess in that kind of coexistence there is this like fragmentation, and I guess the memory is more so in the idea of the process, and this kind of like building up or breaking down of these things, and the fragmentation that it creates in the coexistence of these things.
Thank you all for commenting on that question. So while we were talking, I was thinking that there is kind of a formal through line through all your work and different methods, which is how you work in like series and repetitions and accumulations, right? So there is a temporal I don't know, mattering that happens, right? And I'm interested to hear you talk more about what that repetition is about, because each of you sort of kind of emphasized how memory isn't just creating a thing, an object or something, or evidence or document, but really is very much an embodied working through. But there are also two strains of what that working through leads to. So either kind of narrative, kind of voicing of something that happened perhaps in the past, trauma, historical, personal, etc., or in fact something else, like perhaps like Luke or Aliya, or Fahmy, where it's more about kind of exploring anti-narrative or kind of incoherence or fragmentation, this kind of drive towards narrative, versus anti-narrative, coherence versus incoherence, and all through it sort of like, what are you trying to communicate, or are you trying to break it down? Kind of sedimented ways of communicating anger and remorse. So I think this is part of one of the questions I asked you, but do you feel that the work you're doing has a telos towards repair? Or is repair sort of this kind of endlessly receding horizon that is really the engine for how you're making, essentially?
Yeah, I think my work, I think, kind of lives in that weird, like, in-between space, and so illegibility is kind of part of that, and that's what I play with and work with in the work. And so it's not so much about repair, I guess. It's about an inability to repair, and then the kind of repair that accepting that becomes, if that makes sense.
So, I mean, I was interested in your work in kind of how much you, like, there's this confluence, right, of texture, textile, and text that really moves towards pattern, right, instead of figuration or representation, but all kind of with the grounding, this like hybridization of cultural symbols and signifiers, right, that we work with towards pattern. So I'm just kind of wondering what the status of pattern is versus.
I think pattern, the way that I use pattern is kind of more akin to the idea of like a symbolic language. So specifically it's a reference to, the part of my culture, but also what I am interested in the use of those patterns also is that embedded with these symbols, sort of like coded language essentially. And so sort of embedding those with like a conflicting language almost is where I come from with that. And also that I think specifically, I think because I'm talking about this like hybridization of a system or a pattern, it's the pattern is like the system that I'm talking about being kind of broken down or not as systematic.
No, I mean, just through personal reference, in the citation I mentioned earlier, Garcia talks about how the Buddhism and the audience system has a very significant function. Essentially, it's like a real thing, right? It's like a real communication system in that culture, but to us, it just like us.
Yeah.
Right. So this kind of again switching between codes.
Yeah.
That happens when you're thinking about pattern in one culture, which is pattern, it's just decorative to us, right?
Yeah, exactly. And there's also like the I feel like the kind of the translation between the coding of those things. Yeah, I can swap it out.
I'll go. I think this answer will address some of the narrative versus incoherence, repetition, tell us toward repair. It's kind of a few things floating around in there, but so this project of trying to love the studio or be friends with the studio seems a little bit absurd in one sense, but I do mean that I have been trying to become friends with the studio, but I am also thinking of this as a way to better learn or just practice a kind of love that I would want to be able to offer more generally, not just to the studio, but to people, creatures, rocks, anything. And in thinking about this, I think I choose loving the studio because it's just it's the condition that's provided. It's the first field of encounter as somebody in grad school. And one of the ways that I'm thinking about trying to love the space of the studio, thinking about the sort of conceptual narrative about the studio, that it's a site of productivity, a kind of factory, or a kind of laboratory, or perhaps a hermitage, et cetera, lots of different ways the studio can be thought of. But these kinds of concepts are about like the studio, but not about my studio, which is these really specific walls with these really specific nail holes, and this dumb column that takes up one of the corners and has these nails in it, and then this like price tag sticker that looks like somebody took off of a box of sandwich. It's $8.49, I believe. So I guess the column is for sale if anybody's interested. It's like a red pipe. The light comes in a certain way and moves across the room throughout the day. And I think in giving just to start pulling in some of the other themes of the question, in giving my attention to this space over time as a repetitious act or an act that takes place over a long period of time in iterations, and then of course also inviting others to participate in that giving of attention. I think what I'm doing is not really reaching toward repair or trying to monumentalize an endlessly receding horizon, but instead actually maybe poke through, not necessarily to wound the studio, but to wound the sort of conceptual overlay that masks the studio or conceals anything from my gaze, in such a way that I can see through the idea of the studio to see the actual thing that is the studio. Yeah, that's what I'm hoping to be doing in there. I don't know what to say about the thesis piece in connection to that, but that's the
I think that you said earlier that you feel like you're not giving more to memory, but I would, that kind of negation of the studio as a site of production, right? As a factory, laboratory, as a site for artists, as whatever, writers, scientists, musicians, entrepreneurs, etc., is in fact reaching towards, in some ways, or converting the studio into, as we say, threshold or a shelter for freedom, a type of freedom, kind of threshold freedom, right, or impermanence and completeness. In the right that you shared, you said something like, nothing is for anything else, and nothing is here to be used by us. And so I like this idea of nothing, essentially, this kind of negation of something, as in fact, a giving, right? This giving of nothing opens up space and emptiness for memory or experience to unfold, but especially through this like practice of love as a discipline of attention, which is kind of how you are describing the experience of the light, the stickers, the whatever, the yours, you know. But so I mean, it's interesting to see your work or not see it, experience it, in kind of contrast to other interpretations of memory, because you hew so rigorously to this idea of morality as very much passing and cannot ever be gained. Right. No time gained here. So yeah, I just wanted to offer that.
Thank you.
Also, if you're familiar with the work of Simone Bay.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Very much.
She's on my shelf.
Evokes the
Yeah.
experience of your thesis work.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
I guess maybe more than initially addressing kind of the questions, just like I think something that was, as you were talking, that was like striking to me was this idea, and I guess also kind of embedded in the question, especially when you spoke about the fact that everybody's kind of working in iteration or in multiple, and this idea of like, I feel like this like intense focus on the present that's kind of inherent in your work, and the way that like the idea of thinking of like an intense focus on the present as a form of memory or like an attention to memory. And I was also kind of thinking, again, it's like everybody was kind of talking, is this idea of like the impossibility of memory, or like and kind of trying to grapple with this idea of like multiple and thinking about, for me, I know like part of the reason why I work so much in multiple and it's so important for my work to kind of exist in connection with itself and very much in connection with the other work around it was like kind of what Nat, you're saying, this idea of like fragmentation, and in returning to a memory, what you said about like the place that you are remembering does not exist anymore. And I think that's, so all of my work is places that I've lived, painted from memory, and I think a very like something, yeah, like none of those places exist anymore, and the memory that I have is not of a real place, it's of a fiction, or kind of in the second panel what people were talking about is this idea of like a simulation. Yeah, and I just thought that was kind of this, I don't know, interesting little thing that was happening of and I think Aliya, like we've talked about this in some of your work, is like when you go back, you are it's something that isn't real, and it's this sort of trying to understand a reality that doesn't exist. And so I think there's this need to kind of go back and go back and go back, and the actual act of memory is in the constant going back, and that's why for me it feels so natural for things to exist as multiples. And you know, in your initial question, this idea of like theater as something designed to address an audience is like, it's important for the audience to then experience that multiple in order to get to sort of understand the experience of memory, because the experience of memory happens in multiple.
I mean, looking at your works, your meetings, they were throughout the gallery, right? Like, oh, there's another one. But I mean, you're talking about multiple, but I also feel there's quite a bit of movement, actually, strangely enough, kind of implicit and latent in your paintings, partly because they are primarily like doors and windows and ceilings and thresholds, so like the structure of a room, empty rooms, people in it that may lead to other spaces. So they're almost like ciphers of passage or transition. And really of a type of absent presence you kind of feel. Like, you know, I'm wondering if you could speak a bit, again, as well, like Luke, on this kind of attraction to emptiness as part of your iconography.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think for me, there is sort of, I am drawn towards a certain sense of illegibility, because that is my experience with memory. But I think also, in thinking about memory, a lot of just the way that I locate memory is through place. And the way that I locate time is through place. So I think that's kind of initially why I was drawn to these spaces, and the idea of like populating them. And the reason I think why I'm so drawn to emptiness is that these places become a sort of a vessel for all of the memory that happened there, and they're embedded with that sort of history. And I think there's, in trying to distill it or represent a single memory, you're sort of losing the rest of it. And I think that was something that felt very important to me. And I think also just in terms of like clarity, I would say, and not clarity as in like, because the places are not like, and this is the color that the wall, like it's very much sort of this, but I think there's because a memory an event happens in an instant or a short period of time, a space exists for a much longer duration of time. And again, I keep coming back to this idea of like re-encounter, which is part of the reason why I wanted my work to be like very spread out throughout the thing, is this idea of re-encounter. And so in any room, there's like untold memories that happened in there. And in showing that space, you kind of hold space for all of the things that happened, that when you try and say, oh, well, this one thing happened, you're immediately kind of erasing or negating the other things that you don't mention, and including especially the things that often get left behind in memory. And I feel like, yeah, just which is I don't know, maybe something else a bunch of everybody's kind of talking about is like what gets lost, and by not showing anything, you're kind of making space for all the things that would get lost.
For me, that's actually a really good shift to that, because you bring up this problem of what is real and what is true, right? That's a very deep philosophical question. I don't know how we could make an approach to that, but I mean, the spaces that you remember are real, right? But what is their kind of relation to what's true for you? Like, it's a kind of moving target, right? So is truth something that exists in the real, or is it more kind of the partial glimpse, right, of reality, perhaps? I don't know. But I think we're moving sort of towards like a narrative end of things, where your work is in fact kind of about repetition of an event that lends itself to different perspectives or dimensions of narration in some ways. I don't know if this kind of thought where trauma is stored in the body, how you kind of use the strategy, right, of like iteration, fragmented repetition, various media, towards kind of not just individual repair, really, but like social connection, as something that you're doing, externalizing towards kind of creative building towards like a collective, I don't know, working through trauma.
Yeah, working with like a trauma memory, and there's a lot of frustration around it because like inherently with memory, so much is lost, so much is forgotten. And there's a lot of frustration of trying to understand like what happened, what even happened during that time. And I think being able to work with repetition reiterations allows someone to accept that things are going to be lost, and to a degree it's okay. But it also allows me to forge through that memory and forge through that space. And I really didn't start thinking about it in that way until I read Chanel Miller's memoir, Know My Name. She was originally known as Emily Doe in the Stanford University Brock Turner rape case. And she had to constantly repeat and reiterate and go into this memory over and over again that she wasn't fully connected to anymore. And in that process of her forging through that memory, she was able to see these two bikes, and it was the two people who rescued her. And as I started to forge through my memory and started to break it down and reconstruct it and break it down and reconstruct it, I started to see the tiles. And for me, the tiles were the thing that my body and the pain dissipated into. So the pain and the trauma doesn't have to be fully stored in my body anymore, or this idea of like a memory being incomplete. I could start to transfer it into this whole different material and recreate the space and break it down however I needed it to be.
And that's really interesting, just looking at your piece right now, how when you experienced it in the gallery, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You walk around it and perhaps walk in it or through it, and it's not particularly dangerous, but it does feel kind of perilous, right? Because it is slightly immersive, and I think it's interesting if you could just speak a little bit more about your connection to the tiles and what it felt like to make them, because they're quite distorted, right, and broken, and threaded through with these other materials that we use, wire, cable, ferro.
Oh, it's the little fasteners, yeah.
Just like, what was the experience of like kind of transmitting some of this traumatic aspect into the making of tiles?
Well, I mean, people were telling me to make tiles from the start, and I just kept saying no. Because I thought it would be too literal to try to work with the actual materials, and slowly, like, I kept working with, like, shower curtains, working with tiles, and then working with my body and trying to understand, what's a body, what's a person, what's an object. And the process of working the tiles was actually really great for me, because like I said, it felt very much connected to my drawing practice, and yeah, like I could just speak to the clay, it understood me. And I think also working with play and working with these cable wires, they also have their own agency. They have their own language. They have their own movement through space. So it was like this collaboration between me and these things that are just trying to be cohesive, I guess, trying to work together and not try to fight against them. And part of that allowed me to like keep reestablishing my agency in this own narrative because so much of it had been taken away from me. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, you can formally get really, I'm just thinking about it now, how like in comparison to like a color wheel or something like that, right? Where it's like light and like ominous and lovely to look at. Here it's like it is coming down at you, and it does feel like something happening.
I mean, partially because it's a space we all encounter every day. It's a shower room. It's a space we all most likely enter in every day. And for me, every day it was a space of precarity. And I didn't know it for so long until like right before the program, and I had these memories come back, and I got to understand why it felt so precarious. But also working in like the reiteration, it changed my relationship with it because the flashback I had that brought all of these memories back had such a physical toll on me. And then working with the reiteration, specifically in a community of love, it allowed me to start actually loving myself and start actually caring for myself and not try to push myself to whatever limits I have. So the thing with like victims or things like that, like there's strength and flexibility, but our limits also tend to be flexible too, and just keep pushing ourselves like until the very end. So I think, yeah, working with these materials that have their own agency, have their own limits, it made me pause. It made me start to reflect on like what I actually have to do to care for myself and start caring for the audience too and talking about this.
It's nice about the repetition in your work, and particularly, I was very interested in looking, so it's right here, right? In thinking about kind of your interest in different naming systems, and also how you shared that you have a very long Egyptian name that when you are traveling in a Dutch context is reduced to like Tunisian or something like that. And how do you, and if you experience that kind of this transfer between names and languages as erasure of self, or as a kind of multiplication of the self, right?
Yeah.
Which one that kind of coexists, right, as both yourself. And in your work in particular, it was interesting that I feel like these sculptures, which relate to your co-primary language as 2-year-old in Arabic, are really objects of imbalance and incoherence rather than unification.
Yeah, this is actually a very good, like the two things. This is back to the question about communication and incoherence, which explains my work a lot. But this story that you mentioned about my real name, the long version, that in Egypt they have this son of this, son of this, son of this, and it goes up to 5, 6, or 7 names. In the modern Egypt, it used to be longer. And trying to fit in Western context, which they only sort of see you as a first name and last name, with all the problems. And this just small bureaucratic kind of thing is my entry actually to everything that in my work, using the word interculture that you used earlier in the introduction. I wasn't sure if you used interculture clash or interculture something. It was
Intercultural contacts.
yeah, that's better. Because I think like this tendency to sort of make you fit into a certain kind of thing in order to understand you or see you is mainly what my work is trying to do, is to propose. I mean, this idea of incoherence is my source of frustration always, because how can I be really understood or imagined in the way that I have sort of that really my own sort of agency, rather than as assimilating or fitting to certain ideas to sort of try to be belonging to them. And in this sense, I see this work, and I see my work in general as this sort of, it has the two kind of direction that it connects So because I think I'm kind of caught in this crossfire that on the one hand I have my own critical thoughts to living and producing work in certain context and trying to explain myself, but it's not about what language I choose to explain myself, it's about what kind of historic time that I carry with me that's been refused to sort of even be acknowledged. But on the other hand, I have my own critique to this historic time itself. So this work, but this doesn't actually, is not even a layer here that is considered because no one can go that far. Because actually for people that would look like it's sort of cherishing your own like heritage, which is a very kind of American kind of thing, but it's not, because it is very critical to also how we deal with heritage in a country like Egypt, which is so much stuck in these kind of ideas of like, late antiquity. And in this sense, this proposal or proposition of incoherence is something that I actually want to create. Someone was saying earlier in one of the panels about that you only reach orientation through disorientation. And I'm really interested in disorientation. I actually don't like the word orientation. It relates to all these ideas that I'm trying to fight, including Orientalism. But then, and in this sense, actually, because I'm trying to propose this illegibility or incoherence, actually, I'm using concrete, because, you're always told, like, be concrete, like your language is concrete. I mean, I make a concrete language, but it's not concrete.
The title of the work is "If You Could Only See the Effort I Need to Speak to You." I think it's speaking to your struggle, right, that you're articulating here. But also that just like in the formal experience that I wasn't sure what I was looking at, right? But it's almost like bisected phenomes or something, like not even letters, but just like the audible sound of words, like kind of the way a child burbles, or whatever the word is that I'm doing. Is it burbling? I'm not sure. But it's kind of stuttering attempt, right, to make language.
And it's actually, this is the repetition that what you're talking about, and I like the word Andrea used before about insistence. It's how the child kind of insists in these like things, and through the repetition of these hundreds of times, the child, actually this is the way for a child to get themselves to be heard. And I almost use this strategy in this kind of sense to layer the same thing, and they're phenomena. They're not like, which is that's what I'm saying. The other part that maybe only an Arab audience would get is that this is not any familiar script that anyone knows. It actually is a very problematic script, because it's a very early script that no one knows actually existed. And why it's problematic? Because it's missing all the bounds. It requires huge reconstruction in order to make sense of it, but everyone actually knows exactly what it means. And that actually there's a lot of debate who made the reconstruction and how, but all this is like typically get reduced in this kind of showing experience, which that's why I like this idea of, it's almost like a virus, that it has these different spikes and it's sort of what kind of DNA it's drawn to.
I mean, it's interesting kind of shift to Pauline a little bit, but you talked about how you're excavating, right, or it's like memories of the process of like excavating perhaps things are buried, and you're essentially sort of mentioning that there's this living or dead language, right? People can't, they don't really recognize it because it's not active per se. There's like some shadow or submerged level to this language that only people know. And in some ways, I think that kind of speaks to Pauline's work. There's this kind of affinity between the two in this idea of like translating sort of layers of silences, perhaps, that accumulate, right, within the passage of time. Because in your work, I was very struck by your emphasis on narrative, first of all, but also by its fragility, right? So you have a screen of so many tea bags, right, and bread, and I was curious to hear more about your process, your logic around the fragility of collecting those things, putting those together as a screen, because they're also in some ways a strange like index, right, that kind of accumulated index of encounters with your family and conversations. Like your work is called Dislocated Conversations, right? And so I'm interested to hear about how this particular thesis work serves to create that third space in which narrative can function as a narrative, especially in terms of spoken memory, can thread together these voices or histories that have been silenced.
I think specifically jumping back to the first question about materiality, I think probably in some other also works, I see also language a lot as a materiality, and the way the various memories that I've been dealing with through the work, they're mostly inherited memory. They're not mine at all, but I have to deal with them, whether I kind of want it or not. And so that necessarily brought me through the subjective space, whether I wanted it or not. And I think also memory are never purely individual nor collective. It's like this weird in between, like this weird space that I've been trying to create in the work. And so, yeah, the tea bag, they serve as evidence of research, but also just shared experience and kind of breaking the silences that I've experienced within my own family ecosystem.
I mean, so since you're speaking about family now, it's actually the first time it's come up a little bit, at least in this particular sense, that you think also about not just individual trauma, historical trauma, but like intergenerational trauma that is very much narrative, right? So thinking about memory as kind of not chosen, really, but very much like inherited. This is like the thing that you have to work with, that's given to you, and it's a question that I kind of had in general about how you think about the inescapable inheritance, essentially, that we each kind of have to deal with, in terms of how that determines or can undoes a sense of the self in the present. So I am in some ways asking about your relationship to, or the relationship between memory and identity in your work, or if you think of that relationship.
Yeah, definitely. I think through the work I've been kind of an artist, as an investigator, as you could say, trying to reconcile those memories with my identity, and so the work was mainly and more broadly an investigation for myself, but which I'm hoping can serve as broader investigation, and invite other people to investigate with me.
So I'm not sure how much time we have left. Audience questions.
Am I allowed to ask a question? I have a question for Aliya and Fahmy. I guess, and something you had said about the knots that kind of appear decorative but are actually signs or
They have utilitarian value.
have a utilitarian value. And I guess something I was kind of thinking about in both of your work is like, when does something appear decorative but have utility or the ability to communicate or something like that? But and then I guess then on the flip side, like, when does something appear like symbolic or appear like it has meaning or something but is actually decorative or aesthetic? And if you guys can talk about that.
Well, I guess, I mean, it's all sort of has meaning, right? But for me, I think like an interesting point in the work that kind of answers or speaks to that question is I'm sort of designing these patterns from my childhood, and I'm like from memory, and I'm using, you know, these kind of geometric forms that resemble what I grew up around, and in the things that I actually grew up around, those things did have meaning. But for me, then I'm using them as this abstract form that is sort of like that I'm not even, the meaning is in just the fact that it's sort of a pattern. And then on the flip side, I'm sort of embedding that with another kind of symbol. But it's I think that I forgot where I was going with that.
I just have a comment here, actually thinking about what you're saying, and also Fahmy's comments about Orientalism, which is in many ways, right, the Western appropriation of many kind of cultural symbols is decorative, right? It reduces essentially down to an aesthetic, right, of just an aesthetic, right, a style, something to be displayed. And that, in fact, I think both of you are kind of playing with that ambiguity around being othered, and also with self-othering that occurs in incorporating these signifiers of your cultural inheritance in your work, because, again, it's like kind of back to where you're addressing your work, right? Exactly. You're addressing mixed kind of audience, I'm assuming you're imagining, right, mixed audiences that your work would function differently in different contexts. Things you were talking about in European context. So it's an interesting question about, like, not even just code switching, but like how these signs also have cultural semiotic power structures mapped onto them, and they didn't change. That you don't lose reading them.
Yeah. I did kind of remember where I was going.
It's been so much fun, so much pleasure.
What I was going to say is that I
So
think
thank you.
so the
I'm
way
really
that
glad
I'm using those symbols,
to be here for the
without
last panel memory
the meaning
theater.
that maybe they once had, is actually a similar way that is happening even in
Reaching
like,
the
the
limit
making
of my
of these
capacity
positional
to
textiles,
multitask.
because it is kind of
alright,
this lost
so,
language that
Jennifer
really
Pranolo is an
so
interdisciplinary
there's,
media scholar based
I
in
think
New
that
York.
idea
Her writings
of
on film,
the
photography,
loss
and
of
media
the
have
meaning
appeared
of
on
the symbol
screen from
is
quarterly. The edited volume of Screen
pretty
Space
and
Reconfigured,
I guess
the
some of
Domus
the
Magazine,
like
McCusker.
idea of memory
She's an
aspects and
assistant
also
professor in
the
film and screen
illegibility
studies at
of
Pace
something.
University
And
and a visiting critic
I
at
guess,
the Yale School
yeah.
of Art
Oh,
and a visiting scholar with the Asian Pacific American Institute at
Yeah,
NYU.
for me it's kind of a strategy
She serves
to
on the editorial
how
board
to
for
like how
resolution of
much to
Journal of
get
Visual Aesthetics.
like
Her current
knowing
research
that how
explores
things
the
that look
history and
normal
aesthetics of
to me can look
simulation
exotic
as it
well
intersects with the
for
emergence
some
of the
but then
figure
how
of the
much
user in
I should
contemporary
give
art,
that to sort
cinema,
of draw
and
you in.
computation culture.
I'm not
So I'm really
alienating too
thankful
much
that you could make time
because I
to
think I
moderate
had this before
our
when I was
memory
sort of
theater
showing
panel
very
with
or really staying very
Aliya,
anything that
Al-adwani,
could have
McCusker,
this
Hali Nelson, Natalie, Peterson, Pauline,
but then it's
Rossignol,
about what
and
level of
Fahmy, Shahin.
accessibility I want
So
to
I'm
give
really
to
glad and
in
looking
the
forward to
world.
hearing
And I
your
think in this sense,
Thank you.
it's kind of a balance, like of
Thank
how
you for
much I
having
think
me.
this is also about
This finale of
with the decorative
this
question is
panel
about
day. I first want to
how the
congratulate
material
each of you
itself
on
can
your
actually
amazing
function
work. Thanks
through
for
this
receiving it.
without adding,
I'm
because
very happy to
I
have had a
wouldn't
chance
add
to see it and to be
like an object, for instance, to
So this
the
panel is
decoration, but
called
for
Memory
instance,
Theater.
all the aesthetic
And I want
choice
to
of
begin the
having something
conversation by
shiny,
thinking about
having
the
this
art
type of like,
that title.
these are kind of
So my own background
it's
is
the subtle
primarily
kind of
in
decorative
media
thing,
and
which is
music
again,
theater.
it's
I
almost
think
as a
online
reaction to this
and
idea of what
stage
our
first.
images
So kind of
about the
architectural
Orient
institution
or about this
formats
idea of Orientalism
projection,
and how this language look
specifically
like
designed to address
and played
audience
with and how
assembly
this can be
perspective
sort of
conceptual.
tweaked
So
to
Paul's
sort of
idea of
this
staging
Is
or
that
putting on show or display of memory as organized topics in our resource works, I was struck in my viewing of your pieces as they were installed from the gallery space that differently each of you choose to address the viewer, the listener, the witness in your material investigations of this kind of unstable object and spatiality that is the process of remembering. So the formal multiplicity of your arrangements is to reflect these on scène and putting in place of your artistic objects and provocations around what memory is, how it functions, or feels, leads me to a common analytic that I did, however, trace through many of your works, which is that of translation, or transition, or even travel between times, places, selves, languages, names, archives, generations, histories, and most significantly to my mind, different science systems, or kind of semiotic power structures to make meaning around complexity of identity and experience. So, towards this interpretive analytic of memory as a translation or transition between shifting science systems, I wanted to offer a passage from the poet and scholar Edgar Garcia from his 2020 book, Science of the Americas, The Poetics of Photography, Hieroglyphs, and Kipu, in which he talks about the coexistence of multiple worlds and how through a practice of poetics and translation that we can perceive how words carry worlds and worlds permeate words. And so he says, to quote him, the chaos of the world is incomplete and imperfect because it is chaos of worlds. And each world has its own structures, forms, rhythms, and borders by which organizing gives meaning to chaos.
I would love Pauline.
So in other words, there's chaos in the world because there's more than one world, more than one language, signifying lens that exists to make sense of those worlds. And when we start to recognize that other science systems exist beyond the ones that we know, our spatial and temporal sensibilities can expand, perceive variable and uneven realities of global turbulence and context ruptures, derangements and reckonings that can rise, as Garcia says, to the echoes in which the world hears and understands itself beyond the singular abyss of Western capitalist memory. So, essentially, an encounter with kind of aesthetics of changing signs involves passage or transient efflorescence between people, places, and histories that not only centers the sign, but has the potential to shift us as viewers and sensory subjects from one frame of seeing and knowing into another that may contradict, but yet coexist with the one.
One's identity.
So that was all kind of to say that this is what I take that your works are doing, essentially. They're synthesizing this kind of chaos of worlds and words and systems in order to produce changing signs or to embody memory via the diverse media that you use as a signifier of transition and translation that you kind of give shape, form, or narrative
I feel like,
to within this kind of mutational iconography.
In my work, I think I,
So to start off
in
the
a way, am
discussion,
like
I'm
very,
interested to
very
hear,
focused on the
more about
singular
how each of you
experience of
approach
memory.
this problem of giving form to memory in your work, or basically how you stage it.
Kind of thinking about it.
So if memory does have this
I'm
kind of liminal quality,
thinking also
of
about kind of
between
the,
the past and the present,
as I kind of
cultures,
go through these
languages,
memories and
sites,
as I
what
sort
is
of
the logic
I
behind
enter
the
each
material choices?
painting as sort of
So,
trying
whether
to
that be
fully
in terms of
embody
media
what was
use
it
or
like to be in
motifs
this space,
for
what did
anchoring
this space
a
look like,
central
how do I
presence for us
remember
as
it, how
viewers.
does it feel to try and remember it.
In your
But
exploration
also I
of
think something that
what's
keeps
past.
coming up is who else was there and who else lived with me there, and I think something that I keep kind of, that I'm surprised by, and perhaps like I should not, I'm like, it's obvious I shouldn't be surprised by it, but it's the way that like
First of all, thank
even
you,
kind of the singular
Hali.
experience of memory is not
I think
your own, and it very much involves
part of the
other
reason why I feel
people,
like this is
and
almost easier for me to go
the-
first is
the
something
singular
Molly
experience
said
of
in
like
her
the
panel,
flaws of memory and the
I think
slipperiness
really
of
kind of,
memory is due to other
registered with
people's
kind of what- how I'm
experiences,
thinking about
other
memory,
people's
is this
singular
idea
experiences
of like building a
of memory.
space of
So,
re-experience.
you know,
and this
there will be a
idea of, like,
situation
shared
where I
re-experience and
remember
also
something
a
and I
place
talk
for
to my
you to
mom about it,
re-experience your
and her memory of it is
and
completely different,
obviously
you know,
I'm
and
looking
it's
at painting, which
those
is kind of
everyday
very
things that happen
different from,
constantly.
any of the mediums here
that
and from
sort of-
VR, but
so
I think in my work what I was
I
trying
guess
to
more,
think
it's
about
not. I'm
was,
not. I'm using the singular
kind of
experience
memory
as a
like
methodology
verb
to
or
understand
as a
other
gerund
people's
is something
singular
that,
experiences and
so one
understand
has actually,
how unstable
talked
that
with me
makes
about,
kind of
and it's this idea
our
of, like,
entire
what is the-
understanding of
rather than
kind of
documenting
reality.
memory,
And
which
I think what
is
you were
kind
saying
of,
before
I
is
think, this
this
very
idea of
unstable and
inherited
it
memory
leaves
as like
questions. It's this
inescapable
idea
and
of, like,
the
it's not
effect it has
necessarily
on
something
our
that can
identity.
exist
And I think
outside of
this idea that kind of all
the
memory
body.
is fake,
it changes,
but it's
each
still
time you look
true,
back at it.
and
so
how
rather than
then
trying
you
to
build an
document the
identity
memory,
on
trying
top
to
of that,
document the process
and how
of
then do you
remembering,
understand other people's
mapping
identity
out
on
the
top of that,
process of
because
remembering.
kind of
And,
we're all operating in
for
this
me,
like
I
weird,
think
slippery,
part
like
of the
was
reason
that a
why
dream? Did
painting
I make that
felt
up?
like such an
Did that
appropriate
actually
way to do
happen? If it
that,
did actually happen,
is
like,
partially because that's
what
I love painting. That's
what
kind of how I think.
way
of
did
things
it
to begin
happen?
with,
And
but,
also, does any of that even matter?
It allows things to be,
You know, maybe all that matters is the
unreal in a certain
effect
way.
that it had
when
on
you-
me and the effect
in
that it had on that
sculpture
other person
or,
who experienced
things
it.
like that. For me, whenever because I do sometimes
And maybe
work in
that's
those,
also kind
there's
of
a
why I
solidity
tend towards
to
emptiness
objects
in my work, because
that
it's,
get made. They
there's
exist
just
as
so
what they
much
are.
there, and it just feels
and
so
even if
impossible.
what
to
they are
even
is referencing something
acknowledge
else, and
any
it
of
is
that.
not that thing, it is still itself. And I think in painting, there's an ability for kind of multiple spaces and multiple
Okay, any more questions?
perspectives and architectures and
Well, then we
times
should
and
give a big
surfaces.
round of
Really feels to me kind of
wonderful.
it functions in the same way that
yes.
memory does. In the way that what you're
just
saying
wanna
is
say,
memory
I
is
know
kind of looking
really
at the
amazing
past,
day.
but it is
And
located
thank
in the
you,
present,
Andrea,
and
for
that
organizing
kind of
this.
ability
everyone
for
else who
multiple
organized it,
times
and
and places
also-
to exist at the same time is something that feels very possible in painting.
Thanks, Harry.
Kind of, this idea of
It's really moving,
kind of
and I
port
think
the
I can
portals
speak
that they could
for the
be,
other
and have also
I have
many exist
listened
together.
to and watched really amazing, like, transformations of thought and movement, and it's
Yeah,
been
I-
so cool. You
When
know,
I think
for
of
the thesis
memory,
writing faculty,
I
we've
actually
been
think of
working with you
how
all,
to
you know,
meditate
since the
memory,
beginning of this
how to-
year,
how
and
to mediate the memory.
I know that it's
or
been
what
hard at
kind of
times, but
structure
this
can
is an
we
incredibly
use to
gratifying experience to sit here
approach
quietly and
memory,
just take in.
And then,
Like, these
even
videos
if I
are gonna
use
be
one
so-
specific
it's just
memory
magic,
myself,
and
like at
hearing
the
it
starting
all
point, so
together
but
is
it's
just
not
really
about this,
special.
it's about
So
something
thanks for making
like a
everything you do
metaphorical
feel so
way,
powerful and
like when we
important.
say life's a
It's
journey.
so-
So it's just
Thank
a
you.
way.
Thank you, guys, for being back. Thank you for being back.